Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be back with you again. Today, our guest is going to be Vijay Prashad. And so I reached out to Vijay about a week ago, right after the retaliatory strike from Iran. And at the time, I was just thinking, this seems like a really significant event. Vijay is someone who obviously tracks geopolitical developments very closely in a number of different areas. And in doing so, I also looked at the recent report that Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, with Vijay as the director of, had published on hyper-imperialism. And so we're going to have a conversation today and talk, obviously, about, the last 200 days, 199 now, 200 tomorrow. Obviously, since the historic events of October 7th and the genocidal kind of response that we've seen, about some of the changing, political forces. And I think that this report of hyper-imperialism also offers some interesting reflections overall, kind of on where we are. Some of what people talk about as multipolarity. So we'll kind of get into all of that. So I'll just say I'm sure our audience is familiar, but Vijay Prashad is an Indian historian and journalist. He's the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan, along with Noam Chomsky, and many others. He's also the executive director, as I was mentioning, of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and the chief editor of LeftWord Books. And he also appeared in the films Shadow World and Two Meetings. So Vijay, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you again. Obviously, we've had a couple of conversations over the years on the audio side, but we're doing video now too, and I thought it would be great to invite you on this platform and connect with us and our viewers in this way. So good to be with you.
It's great to be with you, Jared. I'm really sorry for the bad light that I have. But more than anything, before we get going, I just wanted to tell you that over the course of these 200 days, as I have from different parts of the world looked at the protest movement in the United States around the question of Israel's massacre of the Palestinians, whether it's the students now in New York City or students at Pomona College or wherever, I often think, and I'm not just saying this, Jared, because I'm on the air with you, I often think of the name of this podcast, Millenniums Are Killing Capitalism. And the reason I think about it is that I think an entire generation of young people are being motivated into politics in a very different way than, say, people who are now in their 30s and so on. These young people, Jared, I'm saying this, I think, in a way that I hope is fully accurate, but it's how I'm seeing it. A lot of these young people are just saying, not on my watch. I'm just not going to let it go. There's no room to have a debate and discussion. I'm going to go to Hillary Clinton's meeting and I'm going to get up and I'm going to put my hands up and shout at her. I'm going to go to Nancy Pelosi's meeting, Joe Biden's meeting. I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to say what you guys are complicit in is wrong. And I just don't want to be a part of it. And when I see those videos, which are almost daily events, Jared, it happened once and it's over. Almost every single day, some young person in the United States, I'm talking about, goes into a hearing, great risk to their young lives, says, no, not from me. And I think millenniums, I don't know if it's the millennials, but it's somebody is definitely angry. If they're not angry with the capitalism in its depth, they're angry with imperialism. And I mean, I think, you and I can talk as much as we want on this, but this is happening out there and it's real and it's the real motion of history. It's pretty interesting to reflect just on that. Okay, the world is shit, but that's happening. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, VJ, and I mean, it's interesting, because it's like, I mean, the name initially was born out of this kind of joke because I don't know you remember, but, like, especially 5, 10 years ago, there used to always be these headlines in the media that would say, millennials are killing the car industry or millennials are killing the housing. And, it was, of course, it was a reflection that millennials at that point didn't have much wealth to be able to acquire anything, right? And so Josh and I thought, well, let's just kind of flip it on its head and turn it into a sort of positive aspirational goal, right? But at the same time, I mean, these young folks are Gen Z, really. But there was a joke that we said at one point. Somebody asked on Twitter, "What's the generation that comes after millennials?" And we said communists. And of course, again, this was aspirational, but maybe that'll be the case. We'll see. But I agree with you in terms of I often feel having these conversations. I appreciate them all. I hope that they provide people with ways to organize their thoughts and think about how to intervene. But there are people out there intervening right now, and solidarity to all of them who are doing that. Absolutely. So the first thing that, like I had said in the introduction, the kind of moment in my mind, and I don't actually know exactly what sparked it for me, but, seeing Iran's military response, after the assassination of the Iranian, diplomats, military that were in the consulate, within the embassy in Syria, um, you know, obviously these are one that the assassination of those figures in the embassy is something to talk about, or in the consulate is something to talk about in itself, and what that also means. But beyond that, like also, you know, Iran responding quite significantly. I mean, I think some people have tried to downplay it a little bit, and maybe on a damage level or whatever, you could do that, but, it seemed to have, a lot of meaning and seemed to be a real change in sort of their policy or their approach to some of the aggressions of the United States and Israel. And so, I just wanted to kind of start there and see, in terms of those developments, you know, um, how you kind of would contextualize or think about them.
I mean, the first thing I think that's important, Jared, is to talk a little bit about Iran itself. Iran is a country of about 89 million people. It has a very, very old sense of itself. It has a sense of itself having a relatively unbroken civilization that goes much before Islam arrives in Iran, during the time of the Persians. It has a civilizational continuity. The reason I'm saying that is that I think a lot of people, particularly in the new world, don't appreciate the depth of cultural sensibility in the old world. In China, for instance, or in India, or in Indonesia, Iran. You think about Nigeria, Ghana. These countries have a sense of themselves that go back very long. They have a very good sense of who they are. They are not young countries, with a young history. They have deep roots and understanding. And therefore, the sense of dignity built into these countries as a country, there's a difference between a country in its modern form, the modern state, and a civilizational understanding of oneself. A civilizational understanding of oneself. We are Iranian, we are Persians. It creates a sense of dignity that's quite important to recognize. It's not related merely to, let's say, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Islamic Constitution, and so on. It's not related to that. It goes back a long time. You don't fool around, with that sense of dignity and the sense that I don't want my dignity violated. I mean, when the United States conducted a coup d'etat against the Iranian democratic regime of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, it was not popular at all. And the memory of that coup d'etat is intact inside Iran's young people, when I meet young Iranians, travel to Iran, talk to people, and so on, Mossadegh is not forgotten. Mossadegh is part of their, in a sense, their curriculum. I don't mean in school curriculum. I mean the curriculum of who they are, the learning, the discussions, the conversation. Um, the regime of the Shah of Iran was humiliating for the sense that the Shah was using oil money to import vast amounts of weapons. He was the largest importer of weapons in the world at a certain point. The US arms companies were thriving on Iranian oil. He would just recycle the money. He wasn't taking care of the Iranian people. That was a humiliation, which is why during the Iranian Revolution of 79, there was no real opposition to the revolution. It was a complete mass uprising, delivered later into the hands of the Islamic sections, Ayatollah Khomeini, and so on. But the revolt was a generalized revolt of the population. 89 million people with a great sense of patriotism. And this is not the first time that one of their people have been killed in an assassination like this. In 2020, the United States, without provocation, assassinated a leading figure in Iran's political history, General Qasem Soleimani. He was assassinated in Baghdad airport without provocation. Mr. Soleimani was coming to Iraq to have a conversation with the Iraqi government. In fact, would perhaps have been dialing down tensions in the region, dealing with the question of ISIS and so on. He was assassinated without provocation in a very real way. It was a surprise to everybody. So this is not the first time when the Israelis attacked the embassy in Syria. Okay, now let's first acknowledge that Iran is a place of great dignity and understanding of itself, and they're not going to allow people to constantly poke at them without retaliating. That's the first. I mean, what do you expect? The United States knows this. When US ships, warships, go near and into Iranian territorial waters, in the Straits of Hormuz, Iran always sends out motorboats to harass those ships. It never allows US ships free access into Iranian waters. Always comes out and have. Why? Because they are very, quote unquote, jealous of their sense of territorial integrity. They are strongly seeking national sovereignty and so on. Now, come to this direct incident. Firstly, Israel is conducting, as you said, a genocidal war against the Palestinians. The sensibility around the world against this is very high. In Iran, people are very upset by this because over the years, pro-Palestinian sentiment has become part of Iranian nationalism. When Ansar Allah in Yemen, the government of Yemen, said we are not going to allow ships to carry arms into Israel, this was greeted with satisfaction amongst the Iranians. The Iranian press congratulated Ansar Allah for taking this position. There's a great pro-Palestinian sensibility across Iranian society. During that genocidal war against the people of Palestine, the Israelis violated the Vienna Convention on the diplomatic convention, which is signed by Israel in 1961, and attacked a Iranian embassy in Syria. They violated two international laws. One, the UN Charter by attacking territory in Syria. One UN member state attacking another without provocation. Syria didn't attack Israel. And secondly, attacking a diplomatic space that violates the Vienna Convention, killing 7 high officials of the Iranian government. In 1998, when the United States was attacked, probably by Al Qaeda in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, both times Al Qaeda attacked US embassies. United States retaliated against Al Qaeda camps. Al Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. The US directly retaliated. Bill Clinton was the president. And the United States destroyed the only factory in Africa, that was in Sudan, in Khartoum, that made medicines for malaria. The only African factory that made malaria, the Al Shifa pharmaceutical factory, leveled it in a cruise missile strike. If the United States feels that it's okay to retaliate when its embassies are attacked by destroying a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, which had nothing to do with the attacks in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, then what is the precedent for the Iranians when their embassy is attacked, high personnel killed, at a time when the person who attacks them is in the middle of a genocidal war? How can you not retaliate with that great pro Palestinian feeling, that feeling that we have an old civilization? We never really retaliated when Qasem Soleimani was killed. Therefore, this time it was inevitable they would retaliate. And they did. And they will do it again. And it's a mistake to imagine that Israel has some superior firepower that they'll be able to take on the Iranians. You see, Israel has an easy time attacking the Palestinians, who are largely defenseless. Iran is a country of 88 million people, 89 million people. It's 3 times the size of Iraq's population. They are not going to, now, with their high level of technology, they are not going to take this lying down. They will go all out, and they will go into a, if they are attacked, they will go into a situation where they don't care if there's large loss of life. Why? Because their dignity is very important. They have an old civilization. So this should be understood by people in the United States and so on, that Iran is not going to just, allow the US to do whatever it wants. Iran is a country of dignity. They will not permit themselves to be walked over. In fact, they criticized themselves for not retaliating after Qasem Soleimani's death. So henceforth, I don't think people should play with Iran with the assumption that the trigger will not be pulled.
Appreciate that. Appreciate the background too. And you know, in some ways, I mean, this does connect, because I wanted to get your opinion also on the Palestinian resistance, on, what is called the axis of resistance a bit, and the significance of, their role, over the last 6 months. Obviously, as we've already said, there's the egregious genocidal war that is being waged upon Palestinian people as a whole, particularly, of course, most egregiously in Gaza, but also increasingly in the West Bank and elsewhere. And at the same time, there have been these significant shifts in geopolitical dynamics. It feels like, um, or maybe another way to put it is that some of the shifts that have already been happening over the last several years are becoming more stark. Um, and so, part of what I wanted to say with this is that it does seem that the resistance has opened up a horizon of new possibilities and new conversations about Palestine that had been kind of foreclosed under, with the siege on Gaza and everything else. And obviously, this comes at a tremendous human cost. But what are your thoughts on the resistance and on these changing dynamics?
Jared, to get there, let's first start with Professor Jody Dean of Hobart and William Smith College. She wrote a piece at the Verso Books blog where she used the word exhilarating. She said, I felt exhilarated. I don't know the exact phrase, but something like, I felt exhilarated when I saw the October 7th events. For that, she has been suspended. In fact, I think they want to fire her. It's at that level. Okay, let's think about that. I see over your right shoulder, you have the new translation of Ghassan Kanafani's book on the 1936 revolt in Palestine, published by 1804 Books. And I'm happy to see it there because I had a role in the new translation of this tremendous book by Ghassan Kanafani of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And I'm not just saying it because it's over your right shoulder, Jared, but because Kanafani looked back at the 1936 revolt to try to understand what is the scenario that the Palestinians face? What is the scenario? You see, the Palestinian people, whether Christian, Jews, or Muslims, because Palestinians had different religious faiths. There were Palestinian Jews as well, and so on. Palestinians have lived in that part of the world for a very long time. They've had a role there. And as a consequence of European anti-Semitism, Jews who lived in Europe, whether they were in Poland or in Russia or in Germany, France, and so on, European Jews who faced anti-Semitism in Europe, seeking an outlet from intractable anti-Semitism in Europe. You see, Jews from Palestine didn't flee to Europe because of Palestinian anti-Semitism. Didn't exist. Jews in Palestine were happy to stay there. They were well integrated into Palestinian society. It was European Jews who were fleeing European anti Semitism because of the horridness of European racism. You see, I mean, they are the ones who come in the 1920s and 30s after the Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour of the British Empire. Britain had colonized Palestine. Kanafani was confounded. The Jews are coming from Europe, fleeing anti-Semitism, taking the land from the Palestinian people, including Palestinian Jews, displacing them. And the Palestinians, perplexed by this phenomena, rise up against the British Empire and against European Jewish settlers. He analyzes that. Over your left shoulder, you have a book by Frantz Fanon. It's an interesting book. I think it's The Dying Colonialism. But the more famous book is Wretched of the Earth, which Inkani Books has just published in Zulu, just to let you know. Fanon, studying the context of settler colonialism, when settlers come from elsewhere and colonize the land. Fanon argues that settler colonials, in the fact of being settler colonials, have to create a structure of violence to control the native. They just have to. It's not a personality decision. They may not be sadomasochist people. But because of the nature of having stolen somebody's land and then demand that they work for you and so on as labor on the land and to make you behave, they have to create a structure of violence. They have to treat you in a certain way. And then Fanon argues the violence imposed by imperialism and settler colonial culture, that violence that's there imposed on people, creates a reaction of violence. People react violently to that violence. The structure imposes violence on everybody. And we've seen that across history. Fanon is writing about the context of North Africa. He's writing about Algeria. When the French create a structure of settler colonial violence on the Algerian people, that violence imposed by France creates a violent reaction in opposition. You see that in the United States. When violence is imposed on a people, they react violently. The riots after the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles, those riots are an example of the violent way that the subordinated react to a culture of violence. That's going to happen. That's going to happen. But organizations don't respond violently unless it is insisted upon. So the Palestinian struggle starts as a civic struggle. It's born largely in Kuwait among university students. That's where Al Fatah is born, becomes the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And these Palestinian groups attempt over the course of several years to engage the Israeli government. They attempt to engage people saying we demand that Resolution 194, the right to return of the Palestinian people, be honored and so on. That is their politics. Israel refuses to engage them at all. And then they move to the armed struggle because they have no choice. They want to raise, the question of their existence. It is an existential question, Palestinian existence. The Fedayeen appears there. Same way in Gaza. Hamas is a young organization born in 1987 in the midst of the Intifada of 1987. It doesn't have a long history. Hamas is born in 87. In Gaza itself, there's a range of political attempts, different kinds. The people of Gaza organized in Hamas, organized in the Palestinian other factions, the Fatah and so on, attempt a political solution. In 2005, they go to the ballot box. Hamas wins the election. What does Israel and the US do? We don't recognize you. In other words, Hamas attempts a plainly democratic politics. They are refused. Having been refused, the Israelis garrote them. They garrote Gaza. They close it down. Hamas and other factions try a range of possibilities. Again, different kinds of protests, including in 2019, the unarmed, peaceful March of Return. Israel fires on them ruthlessly, killing people who are marching unarmed. You can't say to the Palestinians, why don't you try X or Y? They've tried everything. When you put a people into a situation of violence, they respond violently. The Palestinian attack on October 7th, and we don't know all the details yet because we don't know the side of the Palestinians. Nobody from Palestinian side has told us what they did or what they didn't do. There are lots of accusations in the Israeli media against the Israeli government. Very confounding narratives are at play. The Israeli government says these terrible atrocities were committed. Israeli media says they didn't happen. Children were not beheaded. So we really don't know what happened on October 7th in full. But what we do know is it's part of a history of resistance that comes, Jared, in different forms. This was definitely an attack of some kind. Yeah, that much we know. And why not? Why not that attack? Because, in fact, by international law, the Palestinians, as a people under occupation, have the right to resist their occupation. Now, you can say, why did they resist it like this or that? It's acceptable. Why did you attack civilians? That is an acceptable conversation. All I want to establish is they had a right to, resist their occupation. That much is undeniable. Do I agree with all the tactics that were used? Probably not. Because most likely in a condition of war, we never agree on things. I'm squeamish about the killing of civilians in general. Now, some people might say to me, but there are no civilians. Everybody is a settler. There are no civilians there. I said that's an interesting position. I happen to not agree to it. At least we can have a conversation. But what's interesting now, this conversation is not being allowed in many places. In Germany, they are using censorship and force to shut down conversations. It's reached that position in the United States. Not as bad as Germany. In the United States, still students can go and camp out and say divest and so on. In Germany, it's banned. You can't have the conversation. So what happened on October 7th is not an unusual event. It's part of a long series of resistance by the Palestinians using different tactics. But broadly put, the strategy is the same. And the strategy is to make sure that Israel is not comfortable with the occupation of the Palestinians. Because the moment Israel and the world get comfortable with the occupation of the Palestinians, the Palestinian cause is finished. For instance, the government of Morocco is comfortable with the occupation of Western Sahara. In fact, the United States has delivered Western Sahara by imperial fiat to the Kingdom of Morocco. They are comfortable with it. The price is not high. So they have no problem. It's going to continue. The Sahrawis are not able to remind the world of their existence. The Palestinians do not want their fate. And I think that is what October 7th really was.
Appreciate that. So I was thinking a little bit with your book that you published with Noam Chomsky that we had a conversation with you about a couple of years ago, The Withdrawal. And, one of the things that I think both of you cautioned us about this a little bit with that book is obviously it's a book in part about an empire in decline or beginning to decline. It's also, but one of the things that you mentioned is that, you know, just because it's declining does not mean that it's less dangerous or less violent. And I've thought about that a lot, especially with the the special relationship obviously that exists between the United States and Israel, the things that the United States as a government, I'm not talking about the people who are out protesting and if, but has been has allowed to occur, has also provided, ideological and psychological kind of support for, um, and and I think that this is a serious concern. Obviously, the United States in a I don't mean to diminish all of the wars that the United States has done and the absolute numbers of, human beings that have been wiped off of the pages of history by US wars, because obviously we could talk about, your work and other work about that as well. But I do think that, so I guess in part, one of my questions about it is, do you think that part of what's different is that we're seeing this destruction because of smartphones and technology and everything else now, and so there's a better view that we have to exactly what these imperialist wars look like? Or are we seeing kind of the mask come off more fully in terms of what is allowed to happen, tactically in a situation where you have a kind of, I mean, you talk through your work on even in hyper-imperialism, of looking at these connections between like the United States, Israel, the West, Western Europe, etc., and these other groups. I think for many, it's been kind of shocking the number of, norms and values and international laws that have just been thrown aside in this moment. So how do you make sense of some of that?
I mean, I'm going to say something, Jared, which I might come to regret. So here goes. Um, Simultaneous with this genocidal bombing of the Palestinians of Gaza is the war in Ukraine. It's a simultaneous war. It's a good test case to see what's different between them. There simply are not images coming out of Ukraine that are as horrifying as coming out of Palestine. They simply are not. Bakhmut, these different places, names are bandied about. People have Ukrainian flags all over the place, but you don't have imagery of, thousands of children massacred. You don't have entire family lines, the Ware family. I don't know much about where the Ware family comes from, but imagine the entire lineage of the Wares wiped out. About 400 families, Jared, have been wiped out in Gaza. The entire lineage. They will not reproduce these family lines. Nothing like that is happening in Ukraine. Okay, if it were happening, you would have heard about it. You would have been inundated with the imagery. You would have had those cell phone footage everywhere. It's not there. Why? Because the Russians aren't bombing like that. You see, it's very interesting. When Mr. Zelensky travels to Washington to meet the arms dealers, he leaves from Kiev International Airport. I've covered a lot of conflicts. In Iraq, for instance, when the United States first bombed Iraq 2003, they bombed the airport. They closed down the runways. They had to rebuild everything when they came in order to make it useful. They bombed all infrastructure. There was no power, no water. There was nothing. Everything was destroyed. They bombed the relays, power relays, and so on. The Russians aren't bombing like that. Kiev is still a fully functioning city. There are music concerts happening and so on. I'm not saying there's no brutality in that war. All wars are deeply brutal, but they are not bombing to destroy the Ukrainian people entirely. They're not wiping them out. There are not actually, over the course of these 2 years, there are not, you know, a million Ukrainians trying to flee elsewhere. People have left. They've left the indignity of war. That always happens. Yeah, nobody hangs around. If you have a car, if you have some money, you're gone. You take asylum in Spain, you take asylum in Germany, wherever. You don't want to be there during a war. But entire neighborhoods in Kiev are not being destroyed, in Odessa being destroyed, and so on. Yeah, it's not happening. The United States bombing in Iraq was of a much different character than Ukraine. The US just pummeled civilian neighborhoods, Ramadi, Fallujah. 30,000 people were killed in Mosul in the battle to reclaim that city. 30,000. We forget that. Neighborhoods were pummeled. I remember visiting Western Iraq. Entire areas were destroyed, wiped out, flattened. Yeah. There's 28 million tons of rubble in Gaza. 28 million tons. I say the number, Jared. Most people have no idea what I'm saying. I could have said 200 million tons. I could have said 2 million tons. You don't know what that is, guys. You don't know what 28 million, nor do I. But it's a lot of rubble. And what I'm told is if you bulldoze all that rubble into the Mediterranean Sea, you could create another mini Gaza, small Gaza off the coast. It's a lot of concrete and so on. Yeah. You don't want to do that. You'll pollute the Mediterranean. But 28 million, because the Israelis have pummeled neighborhoods, destroyed sections of Gaza City, leveled universities. They bombed the bakeries. They bombed the fishing boats so that the Palestinians would starve. Okay, this is different than what's happening in Ukraine. It's not just the ubiquity of cell phone images because now we have good cameras. They have them in Odessa. They have them in Mariupol. Where is the footage? The Russians simply didn't bomb like that. It's very interesting. The International Criminal Court immediately framed a warrant against Vladimir Putin for removing children from a war zone and bringing them into Russia. Not killing them, mind you, for removing children. Now, might very well be a war crime, but I want to still emphasize that. The Israeli high officials have been killing, murdering 15, 20,000 children, 7,000 known missing people in Gaza. Of them, 5,000 are children. Not one international criminal court warrant against one high official of the Israeli government. It's not just the ubiquity of cell phone images, it's just that they are bombing in a certain way that they are trying to decimate the Palestinians. And they are saying that the second Nakba, Gaza Nakba, we're going to kill those human savages and so on. So people are reacting to that. People are reacting to the nature of the bombardment and the fact that the bombs falling are either delivered by the United States or paid for and delivered by the United States or Britain and other powers, Germany. The complicity is clear, but it's not just the complicity, it's the nature of the bombing. It is horrendous. I was in Gaza after the 2014 bombing. It was terrible at the time. I didn't imagine some 3,000 people killed in the matter of weeks. This, even that was terrible. I cannot imagine what Gaza, what it's going to be. I mean, I want to cry talking to you. In October itself, I lost 3 friends in Gaza. One of them had driven me around in 2014, another was a close colleague. Since over these 200 days, I've lost 5 friends in Gaza. Some have been able to leave the country. I mean, this is a different level. These were sensitive, delightful journalists. They did not deserve to die. They didn't do anything. They were not actually part of any political project. That used to frustrate me. I used to be frustrated with their level of, I'm just a journalist. But that's the history of Palestine. It produces extremely competent and sensitive people. But they are not there anymore, Jared. They are gone. And that is what people are reacting to. People are
No,
reacting to the fact that they are watching sensitive, lovely people, poets, painters, writers, interesting personal stories are being told about ordinary people who didn't paint or write, And, you know, billions of people around the planet getting access to these stories are feeling the pain of the loss. Those souls disappearing like this. For what reason? For what reason? And the other side being led by a man of no sensitivity, Benjamin Netanyahu. It doesn't help the Israelis that the man who's leading them is a man of no sensitivity. It doesn't demonstrate humanity. And these innocent humans are being massacred.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel the loss myself, and I appreciate you, driving that home in terms of folks that you know, and and I mean, I feel all of it, and for a variety of different reasons, but I think you named some of them quite well there. I want to then bring this kind of to this report that you've recently published called Hyper-Imperialism. It's quite an extensive report. I recommend people take a look at it for themselves, go through it. Um, you know, convene a study group about it. You lay out a variety of you do a lot of things in the report. One of the things that you do is kind of lay out a variety of kind of camps or sets of states in the world today as part of your effort to kind of make sense of the geopolitical situation today, what some people have called multipolarity, or maybe the basis for multipolarity. Um, what are some of the key takeaways for you from this report? And maybe, are we seeing some of these things, further play out in recent events in your view? Oh, you're muted. Sorry. There you go.
I'm so happy you talked about this report. I'm holding a hard copy of it. It doesn't appear as a hard copy. You have to go and print it out. It's 186 pages. I'm actually so happy you said convene a group to read it and so on. It is, in a way, the summary of 8 years of work in the 8-year history of Tricontinental. Um, let's first talk about what we were trying to disprove, to start with. One is I was very interested, and I continue to be very interested in the overwhelming military posture of Western countries. There's something quite bizarre about the fact that the Western states, unable to solve basic problems of poverty, hunger, and so on, can spend so much money on weapon systems of great destruction. I mean, I was in Santa Monica a few years ago in Los Angeles, California, very rich neighborhood, and I was struck by how many homeless people sleep on the beach. I'm just talking now from the standpoint of the rich. It's your beach. How can you tolerate being in a society where you're sharing that space with people who don't have any place to live? You don't even have them removed because you have some liberal sensibilities. But I don't mean just you remove them by force. I mean transcend poverty, build homes for people, and so on. The appetite for ending these things seems to have gone. There's so much money wasted, squandered in the military industry. So we decided to have a look at the actual military spending. The Stockholm Institute accepts that the US State Department spending at 900 billion roughly is the number. We reject that. We looked at Department of Energy, where the nuclear spending takes place, the interest on military debt, and so on. And we came up with a number of 1.53 trillion. If you estimate upwards some of the other military budgets, you come up with an enormous number, well over $2 trillion spent every year. Of that, 75% of global military spending in 2022 was spent by the United States, the NATO allies, and close allies like Japan and Korea. If you add all this up, 75% of military spending is this global North bloc. We found that the global North, therefore, which spends 75% of world military spending, is not only a bloc in name, it's actually a bloc institutionally. It's united by a military alliance, NATO, formed in 1949. It's united by a political alliance, the G7. and then G7 plus partners. And there's an intelligence alliance, the 14 Eyes network, where the intelligence share and so on. The global north actually operates like a bloc. It is a pole. It exists as a conspiracy against the planet. Sorry to use the word conspiracy. People will say, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. Nothing conspiracy theory here. NATO is an established treaty organization. The G7 started meeting from 1974. The Five Eyes Intelligence Network is now the 14 Eyes. It has a Wikipedia page, for God's sake. It's nothing secretive. Yeah, it's a block. That's number one. Number two, the global south countries are disparate. There's no unified global south alliance. There is no global south bloc. Doesn't exist. The global south is a range of different kinds of countries. But we were interested in trying to analyze them. So we came up with an idea that the countries that have strongest seeking sovereignty plus have a commitment to socialism, that's one group. It's a group of countries, China, Cuba, and so on. People can debate and argue whether a country belongs or doesn't belong, Vietnam, but that's a debate. Then there are strongly seeking countries that have no commitment to socialism. Country like Iran, for instance, maybe Algeria and so on. Yeah, they're not, there's no socialist content. Then there are other countries that are seeking to build a project of some sort of sovereignty. And so sovereignty becomes the way we understand the groupings, where to put Turkey, for instance, a NATO member, and yet seek strong sovereignty. So we had this exercise of, in fact, categorizing countries. Very interesting exercise. What we have come to understand is whereas the global north is a bloc and is a bloc with a military, intelligence, and political alliance, the global south is not a bloc. There is no military, political, and intelligence alliance. On the other hand, there are some unities that are there. Some groupings are available. The G77, Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. Regionalism plays a big role here. The Bolivarian project in South America, to some extent the Nkrumahite project in Africa, and so on. Regionalism plays a role. But what we also want to emphasize in this is that increasingly this amorphous global south is finding a way to articulate something or the other. I don't want to exaggerate it. I'm uncomfortable with the term multipolarity only because, and I caught how you talked about, you said what some people have called multipolarity, because it assumes the existence of several poles. I don't think we have several poles. I think there is still the global North Pole, and therefore there is one unitary source of international danger. Imperialism has one head. And then there are different countries that are attempting to emerge in different ways. China and Russia, for instance, are defensive powers. China is the second largest component of world military spending. If the global north is 75%, China is 10%. 75 to 10. It's not a matchup. These are not competing imperialisms. There's a misread of the world situation. If a country invades another country, that's not an act of imperialism. That's an act of aggression. That's an act of violating the UN Charter. Just because Russia attacked Ukraine doesn't mean there's something called Russian imperialism. Russia is a defensive power. It is not seeking world domination. We also looked at military bases and so on. I mean, the thing about this report is it's data heavy. And just a word about that. I am very much a believer that you have to build the theory from the facts. I'm also a believer, and today's the birthday of Vladimir Lenin, who wrote a text on imperialism in 1916. I'm very much a believer that you must build the theory from the concrete facts of the moment. That's called a conjunctural analysis. What Lenin had done in 1916 was a conjunctural analysis of imperialism in his time. We are attempting in our own way to do a conjunctural analysis of imperialism in our time. The subtitle of this text is about the danger and decadence of hyper-imperialism. It's dangerous because the only instrument the West seems to have, or the global North seems to have, is the military. So when confronted with a problem, they seek a military solution. Bomb them, bomb them, bomb them. Noam Chomsky in The Withdrawal calls it the Godfather. Let's whack them. Send Luca Brazzi to go and take somebody out, and so on. Yeah, danger, but also decadent, Jared. Decadent. What do you mean by decadent? Why using a word like decadence? Decadent. Because these countries in the global north don't have a project for the world. They don't have a way to answer the compelling problems of humanity. So I reject this idea that Biden is senile and that's why he can't talk properly, or that Trump is a nutcase, and I reject all that. The issue is not one of the global north countries has produced a leadership. The ruling class in these countries cannot produce a leadership that actually inspires people because the ruling class has no project. What can the US ruling class produce except banalities? You know, figures like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, I mean, Eric Adams. These are mediocrities with no ideas, no compelling way to inspire people. They pin the US flag on their lapel. They put on a blue suit, pin the US flag on their lapel, and they walk around as if they are important people. But come on, Eric, you're the mayor of New York. What is your idea, compelling vision for the future? You don't have anything. You don't have even an understanding of these young people who are brave enough to confront suspension because of something they believe in, which is they don't want to see genocide in their name. These are decadent people. Eric Adams, Marco Rubio, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. It doesn't matter that Mr. Biden is an older man. Age is no bar. You see, there are lots of older men and women in the world of great distinction and clarity. Laila Khalid of the Popular Front, great Palestinian leftist sitting in Jordan. She is a contemporary of Joe Biden. She is a woman of great clarity. Clarity doesn't come from age. You don't have to be young to be clear. You have to have some ideas, a compelling project, a reason to be alive, a reason to understand and assist humanity as it transcends its problems. Hyper-imperialism has produced for the ruling class of the global north a decadence, sclerotic. They are like, the calcium deposits inside the arteries and veins. They are giving the global north heart attacks. You got to get beyond that, Jared. The reason you need a new class to come into power in the United States is because this one is useless.
They certainly they're useless for us, that's for sure. Um, uh, so, I want there's a couple of things that are on my mind, but the one I do actually wanna ask you about, is that, because we haven't talked about it in a while, you had a great conversation with 2 Black on Black Myths podcasts, I probably this past summer when things were really starting to heat up in the Sahel region, and, I thinking about the recent election in Senegal as well, and, the move, I think it's in, Nigeria. In Nigeria or Niger, but one of the 2 where they've kicked out the US military, or ended their cooperation agreement, and, um, these, these dynamics are still unfolding, and, I think they're very interesting ones. I don't know if there's anything. I'm sure you're continuing to follow it. What is your sense about kind of what people would call the Francophone, African world and specifically the Sahel region?
I mean, look, firstly, um, France had a really rigorous hold on West Africa and the Sahel, from Senegal all the way out to Niger. I mean, it had a real hold. Even after these countries left French colonial dominion in 61, many of them left in around 60, 61, France held on to them through the CFA, the franc. and these countries had to hold their reserves in the Bank of France and so on. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. The close advisor to President Faye in Senegal, who's the youngest president on record there, the close advisor has written a terrific book about France's colonial currency, the CFA franc. He's written a terrific book. I mean, that's a close advisor to the new president of Senegal. In the Sahel, in Niger and so on, I've traveled in that region quite a bit. Um, it's interesting that there have been these two military coups in Burkina Faso, two in Mali, one in Niger, and they've all created now a federation. It's interesting how the anti-French sensibility has really picked up. It's picked up for two reasons. One is economic. I think knowledge of France's economic grip on this part of the world has frustrated people. But secondly, the military intervention. France intervened militarily in 2013 against Al Qaeda, which had been emboldened by France and the United States destroying the Libyan state in 2011. It was called Operation Serval. They came into Mali and so on. When France did that, it raised the concern among the people of the region. And the concern was, where is our own military? Why can't we defend ourselves? Why do we have to rely on the French? Initially, and I must say this, that initially the French entered and said, we'll train the military. But soon they set the military aside and started engaging Al Qaeda directly. Why can't we make a military? Why are we reliant on the French for our currency? Why does France take our resources at cut rate prices? These were the questions that began to percolate. And because of neoliberalism, most of the political forces had surrendered to some neoliberal ideology or the other. Very few of them were credible leaders in a move against the French, because these questions that had percolated resulted in an anti-French mood. And none of the main political forces were capable of standing up to the French. And this is why low-level officers in the military took matters into their own hands. And when they were not able to succeed, Burkina Faso, they were couped by another set of officers, young people, captains, colonels, and so on. Same thing in Mali. The coup wasn't able to confront the French, it was itself removed, and a new group came in. And these groups have been pretty forthright. They have returned to the sources of their inspiration. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, a very important inspiration for the young officers, because he himself had been an officer. He was murdered, assassinated in 1987. They are aware of that history. Ibrahim Traore, for instance, very much a scholar now of all that stuff, and looking to advance an agenda. I think with these developments in Senegal, with a young leader in power, with him being advised about the CFA franc and so on, the countries like Niger, which are landlocked countries, they will have now a pathway if they all start a conversation about a post-France Africa. And I think this is very interesting. And again, we must watch, accompany this process, be cautious, not try to get ahead of it. This is not necessarily an anti-imperialist process. This is certainly anti-French. Also, maybe anti-US in Niger, because the US has a massive, drone base. The French and the United States were concerned about Niger, and they interfered in Niger a lot because of the migration question, migrants coming through towns like Agadez. I've written several stories. I traveled to Agadez and so on. You see, the French intervened in the Niger parliament to push a law that criminalized migration. One of the acts of the a new military government, well, it's now a civilian government backed by the military, was to annul that act and to say that migrants and those who help them are not criminals. If this migration is a problem of the IMF, let's say in West Africa, and of Europe on the other side, why should the people migrating be criminalized? Very interesting developments taking place, I must say. So, to your point, they are direct, people who've directly experienced colonialism, one form or the other. It's taken a very long time to begin to make moves to exercise some form of sovereignty. We're not there yet, but the process is certainly developing quite rapidly. And I would ask people to watch, wait, and accompany, but don't exaggerate what people are doing, because there's a tendency to disappointment, and it's not fair to exaggerate what other people are trying to accomplish and have both the exaggeration and disappointment in your head. It's better to accompany what other people are doing, stay at their pace.
Right on. I appreciate that, and I know that you do have to run. Appreciate the time with you today, VJ, and I'm sure that we will do it again. Always great to be in conversation with you today. Just thank you very much for this.
Very happy to be with you, and I'm very sorry about the fact that I have a cold and it has interrupted, I think, some of my brain. It comes like a fog here and there. But I'm really glad we had a chance to talk, Jared.
Always good to be in conversation, and I hope you get over that cold soon. I meant to give you a few bless yous, but I didn't want to interrupt you because you were moving so quickly through it. But again, thank you again, VJ. All right, folks. So a couple of things just before I take us out of here. So one, thank you again to Vijay Prashad for that. Monica, thank you so much for becoming a YouTube member. Yeah, we didn't get into this, Dr. Ball, but I agree with you, certainly. I think that obviously there's certainly plenty of military investment in psychological warfare. And there's also a whole lot of capitalist investment in psychological warfare through the media outside of the military. But that is certainly a big dimension of it. Um, I want to also just say a couple things. So tomorrow we will be back with Kai Heron. We're going to talk about, he has a piece that just recently came out on the Verso blog that is called Forget Eco-Modernism, which is a really interesting piece. It's obviously a critique of eco-modernism, which is one of the strains of what gets called political ecology, but basically, left-wing or Marxist attempts to deal with the climate crisis, catastrophe, apocalypse. Um, and it's a critique of that, and also an embrace of degrowth, but a specific strain of degrowth, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And so anyways, I'm interested in that conversation and Kai's work. I also want to put a couple other things on people's radar. So one, Thursday we're gonna be on with Two Black and Rasul Moat. We'll do that first as a live stream, and I also will release it as a audio podcast as well. Um, but we're going to talk about their new book, Laundering Black Rage, which folks probably read the original pieces or listened to us talk about it perhaps on the podcast. When they came out in, I think, Black Agenda Report. But, you know, great work there. Really enjoying reading that book. I appreciated the shout out to Brooke Terpstra in the epigraph at the beginning of the book. And the other thing that I would wanted to put on people's radar is I don't have a time for this yet, but I think on Thursday, actually I think it will be at 7:30 p.m. I'm gonna get together with hopefully Jason Aja K from HU Resist a few years ago when Howard had a massive, like, 300 student occupation of the administration building. We're gonna have Wendy Trevino and perhaps one other person who were involved in the Occupy movement, but out in Oakland, which had, some of the most advanced struggles during the Occupy movement. And we're going to have a couple organizers from Philadelphia Housing Action, which um, folks may have heard our conversation with them a couple years ago on the podcast, but they were part of the formation and the encampments that ended up leveraging around 50 homes from the PHA, which is Philadelphia Housing Authority, which is of course part of the federal housing, initiative and whatnot, but also from the city of Philadelphia for a land trust through multiple encampments and squatting and all kinds of stuff like that during 2020, when things were locked down because of COVID. Um, and so what the reason that we're going to pull these folks together is because there are these encampments going on at college campuses, and I wanted to convene a conversation with folks who had been a part of encampments, could talk about some of the strategies, tactics, decisions. How do you maintain leverage? How do you negotiate? How do you remain politically clear when these encampments can be open spaces and contested spaces? There's different groups in them. How do you establish security and deal with police? And so, hopefully this would be helpful for folks that are, thinking about this. I know that it is likely that this is a tactic that seems to be growing in the moment. And I don't think it'll be confined just to college campuses. There's a lot of solidarity, encampments and protests and things like that. And so just wanted to bring some folks together to hopefully have a conversation about the contradictions and the challenges of that type of organizing, but also people who, in at least a few of the cases, have been successful in winning demands. And then when you win demands, how do you, hold the people who agreed to your demands accountable? And so we'll get into all that. So I just wanted to say that to folks before we closed out. Again, appreciate VJ for coming on and sharing his thoughts. And it's great to be with you all. Have a great rest of your day.